I'm Timothy Fry, the director of the Harriman Institute, and I'd like to welcome everybody to what I think is really going to be a very special event. I want to thank our partner, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, for helping organize the event. I'd like to also thank Gordon Bardosh for doing a great deal of the legwork on our side to make this event happen. For those of you who don't know, just let me give you a little background on the Harriman Institute. It's the oldest center for the study of the former Soviet Union and the countries of Eastern and Southern Europe, Southeastern Europe as well, founded in 1946. It was renamed the Harriman Institute in 1982 thanks to a generous gift from Governor Averell Harriman. In 1996, the Center on East Central Europe was created to recognize some of the changes that had taken place in the region following 1989. And the Center on East Central Europe helps oversee all kinds of different programming in East and Central Europe. I think this is a very timely conference, and it's the kind of conference that we really like to do here at Harriman that brings together scholars and practitioners on important events of the day. And I think that this conference is especially timely for two reasons. First, it seems as if events in the region are really forcing a decision, are coming to a decision node where important decisions will have to be made about the relationship between the countries of the Western Balkans and the European Union. And as we know, these types of changes tend to be very sticky. Agreements made at one point in time are often last for long periods and can be very difficult to change. So I think the events of the next 12 months are likely to be especially consequential. I think it's also important to hold this event, just given how crowded the foreign policy agenda is and the domestic policy agenda is for countries of the Western Balkans and for the European Union. It's important, I think, for us to highlight what is a very important questions for countries of the Western Balkans and the European Union, given how many other events are going on at the same time. There's many countries, we have very difficult economic situations in the wake of the global economic crisis of 2008, which has sparked a great deal of political instability in the region. And the countries of the European Union are facing their own economic problems at home and still trying to deal with the accession of the other countries of Eastern Europe as well. So this is, I think, a particularly timely conference, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what people have to say. Unfortunately, I have to skip out for some boring bureaucratic duties for much of the conference, but I will try to poke my head in. I want to welcome everybody and to encourage people to take advantage of the wonderful view we have up here on the 15th floor, and also to take a trip down to the 12th floor, take a look around and see some of the wonderful photographs. We have a very nice exhibit up on the 12th floor as well. So during breaks, feel free to explore. So I welcome you, and I'll now turn the panel over to Gordon Bardosh.
Tim, I have to laugh a bit because I was going to start off and say what a timely conference this was. So I was thinking, well, it's interesting. I was thinking for everyone, there probably are only a set number of labels one gives to conferences, and one always hopes that they are at least timely. And I also was thinking it was timely because we're in a sort of mini hopeful mood with the result of the Lisbon Treaty vote in Ireland, and that maybe the way in which this topic, for at least for the Western Balkans, not so much for Romania and Bulgaria, has been talked about either pessimistically or optimistically, as if those are the main criteria by which we might want to judge what's happening. And so I'm particularly happy with this first panel because it lets us get beyond that way of thinking, and that's one of the reasons I was thinking it was timely. So we might think about the timeliness as a hypothesis now, and we'll have to revisit this in a year's time. My name is Susan Woodward, and I'm here only to chair, but to say that I think it really, what is interesting about the first panel is that when we look at the EU accession process, we tend often just to focus on the acquis communautaire and focus on the countries specifically of whether they and their governments in particular are meeting the terms of the accession process. And as I mentioned just now, this currently is a rather pessimistic, depressing picture, a story of which many of us are, in many ways, I think, losing patience and say, why do we want to revisit this topic at all? Instead, this panel steps above that technocratic minutia and even the political criticism of countries, for example, Serbia and Bosnia-Herzegovina at the moment, to look more broadly at the structure of this process of accession and therefore the relations between the European Union and the countries in the Balkans. This, I hope, will get us a fresh perspective by looking at the EU's process, looking at the structural constraints within which all small countries in the world always operate, and these are particular ones for the Balkans, and looking at how the EU handles the issues as well as how the countries handle the issue. So we have three very important speakers. I'm actually quite privileged to introduce Marie-Janine Kalik. I'll introduce each speaker when they are speaking or starting to speak. Marie-Janine Kalik is Professor of East European Studies and History at the University of Munich, and also visiting professor of the Collège d'Europe. I know of no one, in my own experience at least, with more experience in different aspects of European involvement in the Balkans. As a member of the assessment unit for the SRSG and UNPROFOR, the cabinet of Bodo Hombach in Brussels for the Stability Pact, important critical assessments, research on the influence of European aid through the CARDS program, work with the European Parliament and Commission on many things. I could go on at quite length, but we're very, very privileged to have Professor Kalik here. She's written many, many important articles, a very important book on Bosnia, a very important book on Serbia, and she just Friday finished an entirely new reinterpretation of Yugoslav history for the last more than 100 years, which many of us will have to wait for the English translation, but I'm hoping that will come very soon. And she is editor of the very important long-standing journal Südosteuropa. So Professor Kalik.
Thank you very much. I will speak.
Okay.
So, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'm very happy to be here and share some insights on the functioning of the stabilization and association process. My presentation will focus on three questions. First, I would like to shed some light on how the internal state of the European Union currently affects its enlargement policy. Second, I would like to identify some key challenges in the region with regard to future enlargement. And thirdly, I would like to discuss strengths and weaknesses of the stabilization and association process in light of progress achieved before I come to my conclusion and discuss options as to how the EU might or might not adapt its enlargement policy. I will argue that the region is unevenly prepared to use EU instruments properly, while in some countries neither the political determination nor substantial economic growth are in place to underpin the necessary reform process. But secondly, I would also argue that at the current state, the European Union in itself is as much a problem for enlargement as the region itself, although in December 2006, as you may know, the European Council renewed consensus on enlargement towards the region. However, some new problems have arisen. I believe they are four. I just mentioned them briefly. First, there are all the uncertainties that surround the adoption of the new EU constitution. There is a phenomenon called enlargement fatigue, which is often mixing up arguments that concern Turkey with arguments made with regard to enlargement in the Western Balkans. And there's much talk about so-called EU absorption capacity. Internal debates about absorption capacity and on whether or not future enlargements in the Western Balkans and in Turkey would be digestible by the European Union, or whether or not it would lead to an import of instability, somehow delay the whole process. Second, in the Western Balkans, the EU enlargement policy faces really a dilemma. On the one hand, security concerns suggest an acceleration of the process. For political reasons, in order to enhance stability in the region, it would be advisable to speed up in the integration process. On the other hand, if we look at conditionality seems to advise quite the contrary, because institutionally and legally, most countries are not yet prepared to join the European Union. So there is a serious dilemma inbuilt in this strategy. Third, the enlargement strategy, in particular the stabilization association process, provides rather weak instruments, and maybe even inappropriate ones, as compared to the complexity of the problems that they are intended to address. EU policy aims at strengthening state and nation-building processes and improving security in the first place, while using instruments that have been created to change institutions and promote integration. Institutional building, legal harmonization is very much on the agenda. Instruments often fail to achieve what they are originally meant to achieve. Fourthly, some EU member states pursue simply egoistic national interests. Therefore, bilateral questions that involve EU members unduly hamper the process, like the name dispute for Macedonia and also the border dispute involving Croatia and Slovenia. There's currently no instrument, no mechanism at hand within the European Union how to overcome a situation in which one country would block a process which is in the interest of all other EU member states, although there are some discussions ongoing, but no such mechanism in sight as yet. In spite of these concerns that I mentioned, the four concerns, the EU does not consider any substantial changes in its approach towards the region, and this brings me to the key challenges. Namely the question, can the Western Balkan countries fulfill EU accession requirements as they stand now? According to the most recent enlargement report, the Western Balkans have made further progress with reforms and thus towards EU integration. Negotiations with Croatia are nearing an end, and Montenegro and Albania filed their applications for membership. Nevertheless, all countries have still, to different degrees, substantial work ahead in meeting the Copenhagen criteria, and the global economic crisis adds to the strains. Economic activity has contracted sharply since the second half of 2008. Exports and FDI decreased, while unemployment started to rise further. Impact on poverty is very severe. The EU has allocated additional money, namely 200 million euro, to counterbalance the economic effects. However, this is very little money as compared to the big problems that derive from the economic financial crisis. In result, GDP levels range well below 89 levels. This is particularly true for the poorer countries like Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, and also Montenegro. Official date of registered unemployment shows a growing trend for many countries, especially for Croatia and Albania. The biggest concerns, apart from the economic situation from an EU point of view, is the institutional situation and the question of the rule of law, the fight against corruption and organized crime. Democracy and the rule of law are making slow and uneven progress in the region. Countries have progressed with regard to electoral process, civil society, and freedom of the media. On the negative side, there are lack of stability and transparency in government, weak protection for the rights of ethnic and minority groups, corruption, and a phenomenon which we would call state capture. Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo in that constitute particular cases because questions of statehood, of constitutions, and forms of ethnic participation are still pretty much contested, and they do not yet constitute functional states. Any discussion of swift accession is currently, as concerns the two countries, out of the question. Except for Croatia, the Western Balkans will therefore reach European standards as regards institutions, rule of law, and governance probably as late as within a decade or even two. They find themselves in a much less favorable position than the Central and East European countries in the pre-accession phase. However, EU policy is to transpose exactly the pre-accession process models to that region. And this brings me to the evaluation of the SAP instruments. The most important political instruments in the stabilization and association process is probably the European perspective itself, from which derives so much soft power, as many believe. And indeed, the perspective of future membership in the Union has had a profound transformative impact on the Western Balkan countries in that it stimulated reforms and gave them a sense of direction. However, the European perspective in itself does not constitute or does not contain instruments for solving many of the issues that are still in place all over the region. For instance, the EU does not possess any instrument for solving issues related to nation building and even minority rights. There's no such thing as an acquis for minority rights or for state building or for constitutional reforms. Therefore, the EU uses conditionality for solving such problems, in particular political questions and constitutional issues. For instance, when it comes to the implementation of the Ohrid Agreement in Macedonia or the Dayton Agreement and, of course, ICTY cooperation. And indeed, there is some progress when it comes to implementing this conditionality, as one can see, particularly in the case of the ICTY cooperation. However, although there is some political progress, conditionality is often unclear and appears, seen from the country's side, as a moving target. There appear to be ever new conditions to be fulfilled as the process evolves, and also the process lacks any clear roadmap. The conditionality approach lacks any clear roadmap, as it's already demonstrated in the negotiations with Croatia and in the delay to fix a starting date for negotiations in Macedonia. Since the EU got stuck with its own internal debates over its constitution, conditionality is more and more seen as an obstacle in the region, not incentive to developing relations with the European Union. If absorption capacity of the European Union constitutes a condition for making countries of the region join the European Union, then countries now face a new dimension of conditionality that, in contrast to the fulfillment of the Copenhagen criteria, cannot be influenced by themselves. Seen from a regional point of view, it appears clear that moving on with the reform process, meeting standards, and improved cooperation would not automatically be rewarded by improved relations with the European Union, and this reduces impact and has an enormous discouraging effect in the countries concerned. A second important instrument is trade, the autonomous trade preferences granted by the EU. I had the pleasure in evaluating these instruments, and our report, which I did together with a group of international experts, came to the conclusion that these trade preferences had actually a minor effect on increasing exports from the region. due to low production standards, legislative impediments, and inadequate certification capacity and control. Instead, imports from the EU towards the region have increased, and so that one might conclude that who benefited from trade agreements is actually the EU instead of countries in the region. And in addition, benefits from these autonomous trade agreements are unevenly distributed within the region. It tends to draw new dividing lines because countries benefit in different ways. There's a strong competitive gap within the region. Some countries, for instance Bosnia, risk to become net losers of trade liberalization. This is what I meant by saying the region is unevenly prepared to use the instruments provided by the Stabilization Association process. Financial assistance is another important instrument granted through the so-called Instrument for Pre-Accession, the IPA. The IPA will provide this year, in 2009, 1.5 billion to the Western Balkans and Turkey, with a strong focus on state building and institutional building, good governance, and pre-accession preparations based on partnership agreements. There are three general points to make when it comes to assessing the pre-accession instrument financial assistance. The first is that the IPA makes a distinction between official candidates and non-candidates. It makes a distinction between Croatia, Macedonia, and Turkey on the one hand, and the rest of the Balkans, which are not yet official candidates but considered as potential candidates, in that it allows only candidates to benefit from certain financial instruments under the framework of the APA, namely regional development, human resources, and rural development. Assistance is reserved for official candidates only, and this of course will lead to a redistribution of aid from the non-official members towards the officially recognized members. It will also lead to a widening gap within the region between candidates and non-candidates. How efficient has aid been so far? It is obvious that most aid provided through IPA and other instruments has been most efficient in areas of physical infrastructure, while assistance in institutional building has proven to be much less successful. In result, assistance has not substantially improved the institutional setup of the countries concerned. Instead, in some countries like Bosnia and Kosovo, a lack of political supervision and a massive inflow of aid has created aid dependency. The third observation that I would like to make in relation with the financial assistance is there is a strong shift from grant assistance to loans as a major source of assistance, bearing the risk of high indebtedness of countries. It is a trend which has been reinforced by the international financial crisis, because in addition to the 200 million euro that the EU provided as a grant, there are another 1 billion euro that the IFIs provided as loans to countries in the region, and what the long-term effect will be will be seen in the future, but it adds to the already high indebtedness of countries in the region. In conclusion, the Stabilization Association process, although modeled after the enlargement process, provides for rather weak instruments as compared to the complexity of the problems in the region. Current EU policies will not automatically have the same impact in the Western Balkans as in the pre-accession countries in Central and Eastern Europe, and it will take much longer to have an impact. But what are the alternatives? One alternative that is being discussed again and again is the so-called Copenhagen minus approach. Why not soften conditionality? as regards the Copenhagen criteria. And why not soften the criteria of absorption capacity of the Union itself in order to bring also the weaker states in? Such a Copenhagen minus approach would allow outstanding constitutional issues to be solved in the framework of EU approximation. However, realistically thinking, there's currently little hope for the region that the Copenhagen conditionality could be watered down in the near future. Critics maintain, and they are in the majority in the Union, critics maintain that it's not the EU's primary goal to solve conflicts beyond its borders, and that it would put internal stability at risk. A second alternative, just in the opposite direction, would be to invent an arrangement of accession or association below the level of full membership of these countries. Call it privileged partnership or something else. I believe this is not realistic as well, although some of the EU member states would favor such an alternative to the current process. I believe an arrangement below full membership would have disastrous, discouraging effects in countries in the region, both on governments and on populations. There is a lesson from previous enlargements, and the lesson is that the more concrete the perspective, the greater is the impact, because candidate countries are able to attract significantly more FDI than non-candidates. Instead, if you create a second-class membership or a waiting room for second-class members, then you would lose this attractiveness from an economic point of view, and also you would, of course, lose incentive for continuing with reforms. Already the prospect for membership and the process of preparing for accession are in themselves attracting more support and more investment, so I would conclude that there is no alternative to full membership. But what remains, I think what remains is a serious reconsideration of the SAP enlargement process with two major points. And my first proposition on how to make the SAP more efficient would be to make it more concrete, to offer clear roadmaps with concrete benchmarks for accession, leaving out the question of when actually negotiations would start with the country are just counterproductive, and I can't see how such a never-ending, open-ended process would ever encourage countries in the region to speed up with the reform process. So be clear, provide clear roadmap and benchmarks. And secondly, and this has been a point which has been under discussion for quite a while but hasn't been solved in an appropriate manner, I believe, secondly, the SIP should introduce finally a dimension of genuine economic and social modernization. These issues are left to the IFIs because the European Commission considers it's not the appropriate institution fostering economic reforms and economic development. Also, it's much too expensive, and yet I think all EU efforts that are now on legal harmonization and institutional and administrative capacity building would very much benefit from such a more economically and socially oriented policy. Only economic development holds the promise of sustainable stability and catching up to the EU anchor, not just in economic terms or in terms of per capita GDP, but no less importantly in competitiveness, structure change, and social behavior. Any changes in the current strategy would, however, also very much depend on a reform of internal EU decision-making processes and institutions. And this concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, I'm not surprised, but I'm delighted at how rich and helpful and interesting that talk was. I've already myself been madly taking notes, as some of you may have seen. We now move to Vanilin Ganev, who is a professor of political science at Miami University in Ohio. You'll see from your program that he has published articles in all of the peer-reviewed journals in the field that are possibly related to the Western Balkans. He published his book, Preying on the State, The Transformation of Post-Communist Bulgaria, 2 years ago with the prestigious Cornell University Press. And he's here to speak to us about the lessons from Bulgaria and Romania. And I'll be very curious, among other things, Professor Ganev, to hear you talk about this distinction that Professor Kalik made between the acquis on the one hand and the conditionality for those issues for which the EU has no instruments. Are you going to stay there? Or?
Yeah, can I speak from here? For those who want to understand the leverage of the European Union, the kind of power that the European Union can wield in its periphery, Bulgaria and Romania are very important cases. They struggled mightily in the 1990s and the early 2000s to attain full membership, and they successfully did so on January 1st, 2007. And now, of course, this date, January 1st, should not be turned into a fetish. It does not mark the moment of a miraculous transformation, but it certainly is a threshold which creates, I think, a situation resembling a controlled laboratory experiment, because everything that happened before that date might be attributed in some way to the impact of EU conditionality, and everything that happened after that can be attributed to the lack of conditionality, or to the fact that the EU pretty much, as I would argue, lost its leverage, or most of it, with full membership. So even though I haven't really spent a single minute studying the Western Balkans, I admit that right now, keep that in mind when you ask me questions, I still think it would be possible to formulate certain propositions about what might happen as a result of the European Union's involvement in these countries, and what might happen if eventually they do attain this coveted status of full members in the EU. Before I begin with the substance of my talk, let me make two caveats. First, I will treat Bulgaria and Romania as similar cases, even though, of course, they're not identical. It seems to me that Romania, at the moment, is faring much better than Romania is faring better than Bulgaria, but I do think that they share certain similarities, which makes their subsuming under the same category, new members, warranted. And my second caveat is that because of lack of time, I will only focus on developments that are first elite-centered. I will talk mostly about political elites, and second, negative. Now, that's not the whole story. There are developments in the countries that are society-centered and positive, and I'll be happy to talk about those during the question and answer session. But right now, I will focus on negative developments related to elite behavior. So the first thing that happened when Bulgaria and Romania became full members was the explosion of corrupt political practices. The corruption problem, which the two countries had, probably have always had, was exacerbated considerably over the last 2 years. There are quantitative measurements of that. You can take a look at the index prepared each year by Transparency International, the Corruption Perception Index. You can read the newspapers. You can talk to independent observers. You can read what the NGOs, the messages sent by the NGOs. I think there cannot be any argument about the fact that the corruption situation in both countries is now worse than it was 5 years ago. Just let me give you one illustration. In 2006, Bulgaria was declared to be the cleanest country in the region by Transparency International. Today, it ranks lower, not just than Romania, but it has been surpassed by Turkey, Croatia, Macedonia, and Georgia today in 2009. I think there are two dimensions to this problem, and I think it's important to distinguish between the two. The first is quantitative. So simply put, there's more corruption than there used to be. But the second is qualitative, and it has to do not so much with the scope of corrupt practices, but with the very nature. I mean, what kinds of corruption are we talking about? And this is where I detect actually the most significant development. In order to explain what I have in mind, let me introduce a distinction between two types of corrupt practices. The first one might be called cronism, where assets are distributed by those in power to their cronies, which means cousins, family members, collaborators, members of the same network, and so forth. That would be cronism. The other type of corruption would be competitive rent-seeking, where opportunities or assets are provided to the highest bidder. In my view, this is a key distinction, because for all kinds of reasons, the second type of corruption is preferable to the first. I mean, in an ideal world, we would like to dispose of either of them. But on the Balkans, that's not a conceivable scenario at this point. So I go back now to my argument about the worsening of the situation. What's happened is that there's clearly a shift in both countries from competitive rent-seeking back to cronism. And the overall picture is quite clear. Both countries began with cronism in the early 1990s, the initial privatizations and so forth. Then, under the impact of the EU, they moved to competitive rent-seeking because they realized, local elites, that attracting foreign direct investment is part of the game. It's not like they really wanted to welcome foreign investors, but they figured out that if they don't do so, their prospects of gaining full membership would be undermined. So again, the attraction of foreign capital wasn't clean. It was still a corrupt process, but assets and opportunities went to the higher bidders beginning, let's say, roughly 1998, 1999. So that was the game at the beginning of 2000s. Now that they're back in the EU, in both countries, I see a clear trend back towards cronism. That is why most of the scandals in the region involve now family members of politicians, whether it would be the mayor of Constanța, which was a huge scandal in Romania, or the family of the Minister of Transportation in Bulgaria. There are numerous indications that cronism now is back in fashion, and I consider that to be a very negative trend. So, conclusion. It's not like the European Union, as a result of the conditionality game, is able to reduce corruption, but it is able to change corrupt practices. And once conditionality disappears, once these countries, the new members, are left to their own devices, then this incentive to foster more efficient or economically rational forms of corruption, that incentive decreases. So that's the first proposition I would like to offer. So if the explosion of corruption is the first negative trend, the second might be characterized as the destabilization of previously stable institutional and normative frameworks. The European Union obviously values stability very much, as Professor Galic just mentioned. And elites in both Romania and Bulgaria were accordingly incentivized, I think, in the late 90s and the 2000s. They pretty much learned to value stability and play the political game in such a way that some modicum of stability was maintained in both countries. So that the situation in both countries could be characterized as a stable configuration of formal, but not just formal, also informal rules regarding elite competition and relationships among rival elites more generally. So things were pretty stable. Of course, I'm not saying that there weren't occasional crises, and I'm not saying that everything was smooth, but basically the institutional configuration in both countries was, I would argue, beyond the reach of temporary majorities, which is another way of saying it was stable. Now that changed in 2007, 2008, and major rules are now being rewritten. There is a large-scale process of revamping the institutional framework. Let me give some examples. A very good example would be the Bulgarian electoral system. One of the, in my view at least, one of the key virtues of the Bulgarian political system since 1989 was the stability of the constitution first, but also the stability of the electoral system second. The rules are fairly simple, and they were fairly clear, and they were fairly stable. A proportional system with a 4% threshold. Now Bulgaria has an entirely new electoral system. It's very complicated. I don't really have time to go into details. I might if you wish me to do so. But really, this whole state, this very essential attribute of the political system was quickly removed when Bulgaria became a full member and local political elites became much more adventurous. So that's one example of stable system that was dismantled. In the case of Romania, there have been several developments which I find quite disturbing. First of all, there was the impeachment of Băsescu, maybe some of you remember. Immediately, as soon as they got into the European Union, the first kind of large-scale political event in Romania was the impeachment of the president, based on basically virtually nothing. All right, so recently, a week ago, there was a no-confidence vote, and the government collapsed in Romania. Now, that's very unusual, because Romania has almost always had coalition governments, which have been unstable. There has been bickering about members of the coalitions, always. But it's only now, for the first time, since 1989, that the government actually collapsed amidst, of course, an economic crisis at a very bad time. So that tells you something about, I think, the impact of the EU and what might happen if that leverage evaporates. The change affects, again, let me repeat that, not just the formal rules, but the informal rules. In other words, how far can I go when I want to get rid of my political rivals? This is what I mean by informal rules, and I would argue that in the 1990s, early 2000s, there were constraints on how far you could go. And these constraints came from the European Union. If you go too far, you're going to be sanctioned. And now that these constraints are gone, it seems to me that elites in both countries are becoming much more reckless. So corruption is the first theme that I touched upon. The destabilization of institutional frameworks is the second. And now the third theme has to do with state building. And my argument there would be that this process was reversed. In my view, the single most important positive impact of the EU on Bulgaria and Romania was that EU pressure provided the momentum or impetus for state building. Local elites were just compelled to create and maintain functional, efficient, relatively speaking, functional and efficient bureaucratic structures. One of the most exhilarating or pleasantly exhilarating sights from both countries when I was doing research there in the 90s, the early 2000s, was the emergence of an elite of young, very well educated, mostly women, but also men, who were working for the ministries in both countries and were in charge of the European unification. To give just one example, in the course of less than 12 months, 28 units in Bulgaria were created, one attached to each ministry. 28 bureaucratic units that were given prerogatives to now conduct negotiations with Europe. This is state building. These were very young, ambitious, motivated, knowledgeable individuals who now work for the government and were put in charge of implementing policies. So now with the attainment of full membership, once you get the status, you get what you want, this process has been blocked in Bulgaria and has been reversed in Romania. The situation has deteriorated quite visibly. Bureaucratic apparatuses are less functional. There are all kinds of signs for administrative disarray. Bureaucratic performance in general has declined in both countries. Now, of course, probably the main reason why that is so is the exodus of all these educated young Romanians and Bulgarians, most of whom, approximately 2/3, in my estimation, went to Brussels. Now, this is a very heavy logistical blow which no organization can easily sustain. It would be like 2/3 of the faculty at Columbia leaving for another institution. But that's what happened. It's understandable. All of them are now in Brussels, having good careers, making good money. So in a way, that's inevitable. But that's not the only reason why, in my view, a bureaucratic performance deteriorated. It seems to me that simply the incentive of political elites to create such institutions and to maintain them is no longer there. So in Bulgaria, let me give two examples. One is the sanctions imposed on Bulgaria. As probably some of you know, Bulgaria was penalized by the European Union. And the form of the penalty was that some sort of accreditation was withdrawn from local ministries. They were no longer allowed to distribute European money. And that went with a very clear set of instructions. What is it that you guys need to do to get the accreditation back? It was very clear, fairly commonsensical. So for more than a year now, this hasn't been done. Even though it's clear what has to be done, it hasn't been done. So clearly, those in power didn't have the incentive to do it. They did pretty much the same thing 10 years ago, but they're not willing to do it now. So Bulgaria is still banned from getting these European funds. So that's what I call blockage of the process. In Romania, there is actually a reversal of the process, where many of the bureaucratic structures or state structures, particularly those related to the fight against organized crime, just disappeared. Or as the term they use is reorganized. So they were there, created mostly in 2005, 2006, early 2007, when the famous Monica Macovei was Minister of Justice. She created them. She had the support of Parliament at the time. And as soon as she was kicked out, which again, not coincidentally, happened after January 1st, 2007, almost all of these institutions disappeared. So that's actually reversal of the process of state building. So let me conclude now. These three stories about corruption, institutional frameworks, and state building are not similar. The first one is about elites reverting back to their old habits. The second is about elites feeling emboldened to do things that were formerly forbidden now that they're in the EU. And the third story, I think, is about how EU conditionality may be a short-term anesthetic, and once you remove it, then the situation becomes unpredictable. But there is, I think, a common theme that runs through these stories, and it is about the nature of EU's leverage. And I tried to come up with a synthetic statement about this leverage. So here's what I came up with, that the EU leverage improves governability by disciplining political elites. So that sounds probably a little bit trivial, but let me add two kind of details which I think are not trivial. The first is that the economic incentives, the economic instruments, money, the funds do not work very well. Local elites in the last 3 years in both countries have been, quite ready to disregard, to basically say, oh, you're not going to give us money, fine. So to the extent, so here's one hypothesis. It's kind of too soon to generalize about these things, but here's one hypothesis. To the extent that local elites are willing to play the game of EU accession, they do so as cultural beings that covet cultural recognition and not as rational actors who maximize something. They want to be perceived as Europeans, that's why they play the game. So the ability of the EU to withdraw this cultural recognition, what I call, that's what really matters. Not so much the fact that the EU controls the flows of material resources. So that's kind of the optimistic spin to the story. But the pessimistic thing is that most of these elites seem to think about this thing being European as a one-time promotion. I mean, you get it and then that's it. You're European now. They don't, at least that's what it appears to me to be the case, that they don't think about this thing being European in terms of internalized values or constraints or anything of that sort. And that, in my view, explains why the attempts of the EU to influence now, to continue to influence local elites, have not been as successful as they were 10 years ago. And that's because I think, in my view, these Europeans do now seriously think of themselves as European, and which makes it easier for them to disregard the power of the European Union. Thank you very much.
I found that utterly fascinating. As a political scientist, I'm thinking about the literature, Professor Ganev, about international state building elsewhere, for example, Afghanistan, and the newest tweak on this comes from Professor Roger Myerson at the University of Chicago, who you may well know because you did your degree there, though he's in economics, a Nobel Prize winner for game theory, is that the key of political leaders in producing any kind of political stability in these new is gaining a reputation with locals for being good leaders. And so you're saying, no, the focus of their reputation was in the EU, not at home. So I'll be curious when we get to the discussion to ask you more about this. It's hard in this audience to think of how to introduce Gordon Bardos because you all know him better than all of you know him. And the fact that you all know him through different channels and on different issues just shows you how wide-ranging and diversified and all he is. He is formerly the assistant director of the Harriman Institute and the executive director of the Association for the Study of Nationalities, but I say formerly because he is simply the person to go to for everything for the Balkans. So how do you describe that, the relationship between formal and informal? Gordon Bardos will now talk about the historical and structural obstacles to EU accession efforts.
Since I've got a PowerPoint, do you guys want to move over there?
Oh,
Right,
okay.
Is anything coming up? Okay. I think I'll just sit down for this. Susan, thank you for the introduction. Thank you all for coming. And thank you, NIDA, for the help in putting this together. We've been talking about doing this for a long time. So it's fun to actually be here today. Now, I want to start by asking a provocative question. In thinking about the future of the Western Balkans' European accession efforts, a provocative question is worth asking. Are we focusing on the wrong things? Much of the debate on this topic is focused on two issues. The first set of issues focuses on problems within the EU itself, such as enlargement fatigue and absorption capacity, after the EU accepted 12 new members in 2004 and 2007. These problems bring up the question of whether the EU can institutionally accommodate new members at this time, as well as whether both elite and public opinion in the EU will support a further near-term enlargement. The second set of issues focuses on whether the Western Balkan countries are doing enough to fill the requirements for joining the Union. Here, the questions being asked are whether there is enough political will and commitment within the Western Balkans to adopt and implement the reforms necessary to satisfy EU requirements. And in addition to political will, whether the Western Balkan countries have the political and administrative capacity to be good EU members. Yet there's another question that I think is out there that is rarely asked, whether, even given the right amount of political will, the Western Balkan countries can fulfill EU accession requirements as they now stand, given certain historical and structural disadvantages they have in comparison to the 12 countries that entered in 2004 and 2007. This, of course, raises two important questions for the EU. The first is whether Brussels needs to devise a new accession mechanism for the Western Balkan countries if they really cannot fulfill EU accession requirements as they now stand. The second question that needs to be addressed is what are the social, political, and security consequences of leaving the Western Balkan countries out of the EU if they cannot fulfill the accession requirements, and if Brussels decides that it cannot develop a new accession mechanism specifically designed to meet the specific characteristics of Southeastern Europe. Now, I raise these questions because, according to a number of indicators, there's been a noticeable backsliding in terms of political and economic reform in Southeastern Europe over the past few years. Freedom House's Nations in Transit Democracy ratings, for instance, show that after several years of consistent improvement from 2003 to 2005, each country in Southeastern Europe, with the sole exception of Bulgaria, has registered some regression from 2006 to 2008. Much the same is true for these countries' scores in terms of the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business report, Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, and Standard & Poor's sovereign credit ratings. Let's go through those real quick. The countries in red, scores in red represent backsliding. So if you see 2007 and 2008, most of the countries have shown some backsliding. The red's the ones that aren't showing up. But you get the picture of what I'm trying to say. World Bank Ease of Doing Business, and Standard & Poor's sovereign credit ratings. I haven't had a chance to update it with some of the more recent credit reports from this year, but my sense is that it would be even worse than this right now. Now, it should be noted that this backsliding has taken place at the end of a period during which Southeastern Europe has received an almost unprecedented amount of international attention and foreign aid. By that I mean the past 15 to 20 years. Although it's impossible to calculate with any precision the exact amount of financial aid devoted to the region in the past 2 decades, it seems clear that upwards of $100 billion US has been directed towards the Western Balkans by various foreign governments and international institutions and agencies. Needless to say, given the current global financial crisis, it's unlikely that Southeastern Europe is ever going to see these amounts of foreign aid again. These facts in turn suggest that the EU conditionality policy has reached the limits of its usefulness as a tool for promoting reform in Southeastern Europe. If this is indeed true, what accounts for this failure? 2 answers can be offered. First, as the promise of foreseeable, and I stress foreseeable, EU accession for the Western Balkan countries has receded further and further into the distance, it's become less and less attractive for Balkan politicians to make the difficult and politically costly decisions necessary to adopt, and even more importantly, to really implement various EU-mandated reforms. Milica Delevic, where are you? Milica wrote a very interesting report a couple of years ago on regional cooperation in the Western Balkans. And she provided something that was on the B92 website, which I think really captured this very well. One of the commentators noted that the EU has a church-like approach to the countries of Southeastern Europe, insofar as the countries, and I quote, countries in the region are expected to behave the way the EU tells them to admit their past mistakes, but in the end, the message is that no benefits come in this lifetime. This viewpoint is especially true of politicians who are understandably hesitant to commit to unpopular political and economic reforms for the sake of a reward that will only come 2 or 3 electoral cycles down the line. To give you a sense of that, that's the sort of downward sloping curve in terms of incentives. Ivica is nodding his head as a politician. I think he understands this very well, of what a lot of people in government in Southeastern Europe are facing right now. Perhaps more importantly, however, and here I really come to the point of my own presentation, is that for a variety of historical and structural reasons, several of the Western Balkan countries simply may not be able, even given the requisite amount of political will, to fulfill the requirements of EU integration within a reasonable time span. The historical reasons for this are quite clear. The countries that entered the EU in 2004 and 2007 enjoyed an interlude of some 60 years since the last time they had experienced major violence or warfare on their territory. By contrast, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Kosovo, and Serbia, and to lesser extents Macedonia and Montenegro, have experienced large-scale military conflict in the last 2 decades. We should not underestimate the problems this poses in terms of the amount of energy that has to be devoted to political reconciliation, rebuilding trust in governing institutions, and even in rebuilding basic physical and economic infrastructure. And of course, in the case of Kosovo, all of these problems are compounded by the fact that 5 members of the EU have not recognized its declaration of independence. Similarly, the countries that joined the Union in 2004 and 2007 were not burdened by such legacies of war as the need to cooperate with the ICTY. We all know the difficulties Croatia and Serbia have had in trying to satisfy international expectations about the degree to which they are cooperating with the ICTY. The most serious manifestation of which has been the unwillingness of the EU to ratify Serbia's SAA until Ratko Mladic is apprehended and turned over to the Hague Tribunal. One final historical reason why some of the Western Balkan countries may not be able to fulfill EU accession requirements, and Marie-Janine talked about this in her presentation, in the way that some of the countries that joined in earlier waves of enlargement were able to, is the fact that entering the EU today has become much more difficult over the past several decades than it was for earlier waves of entrance. The requirements that Greece, Spain, or Portugal had to fulfill back in the 1980s for joining the EU were clearly nowhere near as extensive as those facing Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, or Macedonia today. Apart from these historical problems and the obstacles imposed by EU conditionality, perhaps an even more difficult problem the Western Balkan countries have to deal with is structural, i.e. the fact that the remaining multi-ethnic states in the region do not enjoy the domestic public legitimacy and support that the more mono-ethnic states that entered the EU in 2004 and 2007 had. A large body of political science literature, from John Stuart Mill to Robert Dahl, has been devoted to the problems that polities and societies face when they have to deal with the social divisions imposed by a heterogeneous population, both in terms of how political processes in such countries work and in terms of economic performance. As one important recent statement on this issue argued, one of the most powerful hypotheses in political economy is the notion that social divisions undermine economic progress, not just in extremis, as in the case of civil war, but also in more normal times. The idea is that even in a market economy, there are numerous transactions that rely on the cooperation of others. Trade often requires trust, providing public goods needs collective action and the rule of law, and the rule of law is only possible if everyone accepts the rights of others. Homogeneous societies, it is suggested, have an advantage because there may be more contact across the population, which builds understanding, trust, and empathy and shared interests. This makes it more likely that they will all be on the same side. In fact, around the world, examples from Africa, Asia, and Eastern Europe have shown that the political decision-making process, and consequently, the determination of such things as the provision and distribution of public goods and the loyalty of various groups to the state are all easier and more effective in states that have higher levels of ethnic homogeneity. This theoretical standpoint has been amply borne out in post-1989 East Central Europe, where more ethnically homogeneous states have enjoyed considerably more success in adopting the political, legal, and economic reforms required for EU accession than the more ethnically heterogeneous ones. For instance, in the 12 countries that joined the EU in 2004 and 2007, the state nation's percentage of the population, by state nation I mean the largest ethnic groups. So in Bulgaria it would be the Bulgarians, in Hungary it would be the Hungarians, and so forth. The state nation's percentage of the population was 82.5%. By way of comparison, let's see. By way of comparison, this table shows the similar percentages for 3 countries of the Western Balkans. So for those of you that can't see, for the 12 countries that got in 2004 and 2007, the average of the state nation percentage was 82.5. For Bosnia today, it's 48%. For Macedonia, it's 64%. For Montenegro, it's 43%. Yeah, Cyprus was as well. Evidence and manifestations of how these ethnic and social divisions, as well as the problems imposed by outside conditionality, play out in real life are easy to see. Today, Bosnia and Herzegovina is debating the same issues, such as the division of authority between the central and regional governments and the distribution of power between different ethnic groups, that it was debating almost 20 years ago. The Bosnian parliament elected in 2006 had only managed to pass 22 laws by December of 2008. And an analysis by a Sarajevo NGO recently estimated that at such a rate, it will take that body 50 years to pass all the legislation needed for EU accession. I've talked to Tim about this. Tim disagrees with all this, so he'll get into the conversation at some point. Enormous amounts of political energy and time have been consumed in Serbia over the past several years over the Kosovo issue, of course. Macedonia barely avoided an interethnic civil war in 2000 and 2001. And more recently, Ali Ahmeti's Democratic Union for Integration, the DUI, boycotted parliament for much of 2006 and 2007, making it impossible to pass legislation required for EU accession. The vision for the future of Macedonia, as laid out in the Ohrid Accords, is increasingly being questioned in the country today, as a number of prominent politicians are beginning to suggest that Ohrid did not go far enough, and as a result, that Macedonia really needs to be turned into a binational federal state. If this comes to pass, it will virtually guarantee that political energies and emotions in Macedonia over the next few years will be overwhelmed by debates over the very nature of the Macedonian state, rather than over the political and economic reforms needed for EU accession. And we should not forget all of the problems Macedonia's EU accession hopes are facing due to the ongoing name dispute with Athens, or the problems Croatia's accession efforts have faced due to its border dispute with Slovenia. It's not difficult to imagine how many potential disputes are waiting down the line with regard to Serbia, Bosnia, and Kosovo. Those are a list of the actual disputes we have now, and if you use your imagination a little bit, you can see how many are coming down the line, potentially, if something is not done about the way the process is handled. Now, on the good news, I do want to say that the former Prime Minister of Croatia, Ivo Sanader, was standing here 4 months ago in June, and Prime Minister Sanader promised that if and when Croatia gets into the EU, it promises that it won't be playing the same games with its other neighbors. So hopefully that'll stay true. Now, given the preceding analysis, if the policy of EU conditionality has reached the limits of its effectiveness, and the Western Balkan countries are structurally incapable of satisfying the requirements for EU accession within reasonable timeframes, then Brussels has to make a choice. Either it calculates the pros and cons of simply leaving the Western Balkans outside the Union, or it comes up with a new or modified accession mechanism to let the Western Balkan countries in within a foreseeable period. Many European politicians understand the consequences of leaving the Balkans outside of the Union are simply too great to bear. As Carl Bildt, one of Europe's most experienced Balkan hands, has noted, if Europe takes away the guiding beacon which has guided the reform policies of the region for the past few years, then instead of the magnet of European integration, we might well go back to seeing the policies of the region driven by the fears and prejudices of nationalism. It's not too difficult to foresee the various scenarios in which the practical consequences of fears and prejudices of nationalism coming back to dominate Balkan politics and society again are played out. For several countries in the region, the possibility and hope of near-term EU accession is the only thing, and I stress the only thing, keeping these countries together. Take away this possibility, then the political and social logic of Balkan ethno-confessional nationalism suggests that several of the states in southeastern Europe will become weak versions of today's Bosnia. Think about that, weak versions of today's Bosnia. States characterized by stagnant, divided, and corrupt political systems unable to resolve the fundamental economic and social problems their populations face. For the EU, the political and security risks posed by a region composed of such weak states are obvious. The choice for Europe is whether it will risk allowing the region to stagnate and thereby again allow Southeastern Europe to become a region characterized by nationalist conflicts and widespread poverty, crime, and corruption, or whether it will have the foresight to develop innovative strategies for integrating the Western Balkans into the Union. So thank you. That's it.
I'm not sure if it was a provocative question, but it was certainly a provocative answer. And I'll be very curious, Gordon, to see whether you are agreeing with the Copenhagen Minus group or something, a third alternative to the two that Marie-Janine Kalik already gave us. So we now happily have 40 minutes before we need to stop for lunch time, and I am now opening the discussion to the floor. And this discussion means you may make comments. Some of you have already been invited to do so, or ask questions. And Gordon, may I ask you, people are supposed to go to the...
Yes, please.
So please come to the microphone in the center because this is being recorded. Go ahead, Nida. Thank you. But you have to come up here. So.
I don't have far to go. I have a question for Venelin. I thought it was a really a remarkable feat to sort of look at how to sort of unpack the impact of the post-accession period. There was a conference at SAIS just a week ago in Washington looking at sort of the data of the entire region, not just Romania and Bulgaria, and sort of trying to figure out what went wrong, what are the, and I think this is one of the first attempts that I've actually seen of a political scientist actually looking at the details of this thing. Have you seen this trend in other countries? I mean, do you think it's just, is there something specific about Romania and Bulgaria? Were they really, really not ready, as many people are sort of accusing them or accusing the EU of letting in countries that weren't ready? Or do you see, I think there must be similar trends, at least in the Freedom House indices in Lithuania and to some extent in Poland. Do you see this as a regional thing? And is there any hope to change it in the post-accession period?
Should we answer now or maybe
Why,
we can
yeah,
wait?
no, why don't you do so? Because then it'll give people some time to think
okay.
about it. And all three of you, I'm going to ask you.
Okay.
We're negotiating. It's me you ask.
Okay.
But this is fine. I was telling Venelin that he could answer now so people would have a chance to think of questions, but go ahead.
Okay.
And so then now let's reverse, let's gather three or so and then we'll, and I want to invite the three of you to speak to each other too in terms of things you say.
Well, I just wanted to share an impression that we have in the region regarding Bulgaria and Romania. Namely, I have the impression that the leverage of Brussels has actually increased once Romania and Bulgaria became members of the European Union, meaning that even whispers and rumors from Brussels have sometimes a tectonic effect in Bulgarian and Romanian politics. So Brussels is more present nowadays in Romanian and Bulgarian than before the accession. So I want you to comment it, because this is an impression that not only I have in Macedonia, but a lot of people throughout the region.
Okay, let me...
No, we're going to do three
Oh,
at a
okay,
time.
sure.
May I say to people in the audience, you don't need to wait for me to recognize you. If you want to come and get in line behind the microphone, I'm happy to let you do that. Go ahead.
I actually have a related question, so I wanted to tag it on. Conditionality, especially I'm a political science student, has been seen as a tool of democratization. And I'm curious, given these effects that you're seeing within Bulgaria and Romania, if you would speak to the overall legitimacy as conditionality as a tool of reform, given the fact that it does appear that Bulgaria and Romania, in your assessment, has unraveled to some extent, especially institutionally speaking, and of course the very serious impact of the political elites within the political system. Thank you.
Let me also ask a question. I'd like to ask one to Marie-Janine Kalik, and in some ways it relates to the comparison with Romania and Bulgaria, which is when you mentioned that what the process should do is introduce economic and social modernization, that they've left that to the IFIs. I'd love to have you say more about what you have in mind about that, because the implicit comparison with Romania and Bulgaria is there as well, as if maybe that's one of the things that wasn't done. So Venelin, would you like to begin?
Okay. Thanks for the questions. Let me answer first the question about how rumors in Brussels cause earthquakes in Sofia and Bucharest. I just haven't seen that. Or maybe what that statement refers to is that rumors in Brussels mobilize social forces in Romania and Bulgaria, which then exert pressure on the governments so that something might happen. So let me explain what I have in mind. Certainly I cannot think of a single case where Brussels was able to, having made clear what its priorities are, was able to compel elites in Romania or Bulgaria since 2007 to follow these priorities. I just don't see that happening. However, it's true, and I mentioned that at the beginning of my talk, that my talk will be very one-sided. I talked about elites and negative developments. However, there are positive developments related to the kind of equilibrium of power or distribution of power in society, so that now those social constituencies that favor Europeanization broadly defined, everything good that they expect to come from, to accrue as a result of full membership, it's easier now for these constituencies to mobilize. It's easier now for them to expose the wrongdoings of elites. And in a way, I think, even though it's too early, but I think it's easier for them to mobilize electoral support. So there will be elections in Romania next month, but if the elections held in Bulgaria are to be any indicator, that's my hope, because the party that basically said, look, this thing about Europe, we're serious about it, and the incumbents are not. They won the elections, and now, of course, it's too early to say what's going to happen, but probably they will be more serious about Brussels than the triple coalition, which lost the elections. So again, I think there is a way to reconcile what I'm saying and what you're saying, namely what I described as kind of the elite's aloofness, and also the fact that rumors in Brussels have an impact, but the missing agent here is, you know, society is not a good, very abstract term, but I think you understand what I have in mind. Okay, the legitimacy of the process, again, I guess that's what I was trying to explain at the end of my talk when I refer to these elites as cultural beings. If there is a consensus in society that becoming a European is a good thing, if that's the way we want to think about ourselves as who we are, then conditionality would be both legitimate but also effective. And if there's no such consensus, then the opposite would be true. In that regard, again, I probably shouldn't describe this allegiance to Europe as a cultural constant, in the sense that, you know, things change. In Bulgaria, there was no consensus in the early 90s because I don't know whether the majority, but at least a substantial minority of the population believed that the future lies with Russia. And, you know, the pan-Slavic story, that changed in the late 90s. So European is the label that Bulgarians want to attach to themselves. But again, that's my point. I mean, if that's not the case, then it's not going to work. It will lack legitimacy. And with regard to the third question about the trends, yes, certainly there is a regional trend. I mean, Poland. Actually, the reason, what got me thinking about this was a statement by the former Polish President Kwasniewski when I asked him about, that was 3 or 4 years ago, why are these weird parties winning votes in Poland? And he told me, well, because we are in Europe now, we can basically do whatever we want. It's like a professor getting tenure. It's pretty much the same thing, I suppose. And, so yes, there is a regional trend. I haven't obviously studied it scientifically, so I cannot really go into more detail. But this effect of, you know, the kids getting crazy when the parents leave the house, I think that is observable throughout the region. Now, how far is it going to go? Whether it will be reversed, how much damage will that generate? I think it's probably too early to say, because certainly, as I indicated, there are counter forces. There are social forces now in these countries that try to play the role which the EU played, which is discipline political elites, and these social forces are gaining strength. So I wouldn't end with a very pessimistic prediction that this trend will inevitably lead to some sort of drastic political deterioration, because there are those who resist it. Society, basically, I don't like the term society, but it would be fair to say that society resists that in both Romania and Bulgaria. But again, that is a general proposition, let's not get carried away here. It's only been 3 years, it's too early to generalize. Everything I say is along the lines of preliminary hypothesis.
Should I answer the question about social and economic dimension? I think there are three different approaches. The first one is making use of those instruments which are already in place, those instruments which the EU already has in place. For instance, in the framework of the IPA, make Western Balkan non-official countries, potential countries, eligible for all lines of support, like rural development and human development. Second thing would be inventing new instruments which are not already in place. Now, both the IFIs and also the European Union has been focusing very much on reconstruction and infrastructure investment. And they have been totally neglecting dimensions like, for instance, job creation or education, which would make an investment in people and make an investment in finding people their own way of earning enough to stay in their countries. And the third approach would be pulling together what others have been doing. There's a huge lack of coordination and cooperation between EU programs and, for instance, World Bank programs, although they are then sometimes doing very similar things. But I think there could be a lot more cooperation and reinforcement of programs that are already in place, and by doing it in a more coordinated and cooperative way, they could be much more effective than they have been so far.
Great, thank you. Go ahead.
Gordon asked us to be provocative today, so maybe I can provoke Gordon now, although I don't have
Can you speak
any.
a little louder? Or maybe we need to pull the, can you, well, get closer
Well,
maybe. Yeah,
maybe
thanks.
I can also just talk louder or without the microphone. For the last year, I've been talking about this theory that Gordon's a little bit referred to, that the next, for me, the biggest problem in Serbian politics now would be that the next elections cannot be won on the sort of pro-Europe ticket, that message is not going to be the one that's going to enable a democratic government. But having returned from Belgrade yesterday and having been there for the last 10 days, I somehow maybe have come to question that point of view. And why that? Well, I started thinking while I was there, what are the problems facing the Democratic Party or the current president and the current government? And I think that perhaps those problems are just so manifold that it becomes a question on how many fronts can you actually fight a war. So if the current president is challenged by a person within his party, probably the number 2 person within the party's internal politics is now someone who often challenges him, Sutanovas, so you're fighting within your party or struggling within your party, then you have an economic problem that's very apparent, at least to me, in Serbia. I think the economy has not grown. I think there's an economic problem. So then you have to try to keep the economy level so that you can get elected or that society can go on at all. Perhaps some of the relations between Russia and other countries have more to do with that also and less to do with the economic settlements. And then on top of that, you're fighting tycoons or organized business interests. I think it becomes very difficult then to see how to approach Europe as a EU integration as some kind of a focus. That perhaps it's not really a lack of will to have that as the message, and maybe not as cynical as I have been interpreting it in the last year, that it's just a question of elections and what the election message will be, but that the serious problems are very manifold. And I don't know, I guess for me it would be those 3 things: internal opposition within your own party or your own constituency, economy as a general problem, and then, yeah. So I'm not sure that's a direct question, but it was something that I thought about.
Okay, fine. There are other people. Thanks. I'll ask the three of you to wait for another 4.
Hi. I'm going to offer a comment. I think I'll hold this. I'm going to offer a comment and then a question. First, I'd like to be psychiatrist to the profession a little bit. I think we suffer from doom and gloom so much that we lack the perspective of what's happened in this region since I'm old enough to remember 1989. If you landed in the United States in 1860, you would find a country ruled by white men with property and a country that kept slaves and didn't give the women the vote for another 50 years. I think we have to, if you push those numbers that Gordon put up there backwards, you would find to 1989 or 90, you would find those numbers quite different. And if we keep that in perspective, maybe we won't be so gloomy. I've just come from Azerbaijan, and if you want to see what a post-Soviet backsliding state really looks like, where the president declares himself president for life and beats up and jails the opposition, that maybe would keep us. I mean, Romania, the government fell. That's what's supposed to happen. The government fell, it'll come back, they'll have a debate. So I think there's a bit too much of the doom and gloom here and failure to recognize what's happened. That's my comment. My question is, with regard to the EU's lack of clout, the EU's lack of legitimacy, I wonder if you would comment on the significance to the region of what the EU did not do with regard to Cyprus, where instead of holding the feet to the fire of a divided country and saying you're not going to get in unless you, meaning the Greek Cypriots, accept the agreement or offer an alternative, they didn't do so. And that told the rest of the world that they won't be serious when it comes to other divided countries, including those in the Western Balkans. Thanks.
Hi. I think my question is related to the Cyprus issue as well. So given the power of conditionality and the loss of leverage once the countries join the Union, I wanted to talk about the conflict between Serbia and Kosovo. So do you think that a solution, or the necessary solution, is that it becomes a condition for Serbia to recognize Kosovo before it can join the EU? Or should the two countries join at the same time, or what's the solution there? Thanks.
Hello. The first two people who asked questions in this batch, I think, have provided very good examples or illustrations, and that's why I got up to speak now, adding a fourth question. I apologize. But for something that maybe is what we have been, in a way, saying, or it's in the literature that I am not very familiar with, but that I find it very useful to distinguish in how Europe and European accession has influenced the countries that have acceded and the ones that aspire to accede. There are two channels, and one is the fact that it affects a democratic process that is only working itself out, but by giving an overwhelming goal to all the electorate. There is the one thing that the political elites are not allowed to challenge in the pre-accession process is the chances of the country of becoming a member. And the clearer, the more empirical that goal is, the more effective it is. And this is how it worked in the first 12. But the other one is the effect that Europe has with the conditionality it imposes, which says, adopt this acquis, adopt that acquis, meet these criteria, meet those criteria, which in some cases have provided the tools to resolve internal differences and conflicts and to find the balance of powers that democratic societies are, if they are functioning. And in some cases, it just provided the possibility to fudge the answers under the carpet. And to my mind, what has happened after accession is that now it's not so much that the elites have become irresponsible, and they were more responsible before. They're always the same politicians that just want to make sure they cling to power and get reelected with more or less social conscience or not. But suddenly these conflicts or the fudging under the carpet needs to get resolved. Now, why do I like to think about this? Because I think that then if we can recognize this, then maybe the countries that are now in the accession process, with the exception of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo, which I'll say in a minute why, are actually working this out. And maybe by eventually, because they have more time, and because the accession process is a more distant, the accession chances is a more distant chance, the overall pressure of fudging everything under the carpet is less strong. So if that's true, then maybe in a few years, actually, if Croatia, Serbia, and Montenegro and Macedonia get accession in the EU, maybe the day after, the change in behavior wouldn't be as bad. And if we think so, and we can advocate that, it might also make it easier for us to propose, to convince Europe not to be too scared. Now, my problem is with Kosovo and Bosnia and Herzegovina, where in fact the intervention of international community and in creating solutions and finding solutions is much, much stronger. And therefore, I'm not sure that this working out is happening as clearly. And in that context, I wanted to ask Marie-Janine, when you say Europe doesn't have state-building instruments, for example, what exactly, do you have something in mind, and how you would describe that? And then my question is, would Europe use them wisely enough? Or maybe all you want is to have just the beacon that forces societies to sometimes take difficult decisions, but in the end, let them figure out how they become a 21st century democracy.
Utterly fascinating, Corey. I was tempted to say at one point that in both the case of Greece, people forget how Greece was thought about after it was a member, and especially with Andreas Papandreou, who was the obstructionist for everything, and how different it is, and how in Cyprus they certainly, after membership, weren't very cooperative. One does begin to wonder whether there is a temporal process here and what the dimensions are that make it move in a particular direction. I'm going to start at the end of the table, Gordon. Would that be all right? And then Venelin, and then Marie-Janine.
See, let me start with Rena's question. No, I basically agree with you. I think it was a very pleasant surprise to a lot of people, myself included, how the Serbian parliamentary elections turned out last year after Kosovo declared independence. A lot of people were expecting things to go the other way. But it does show how important this possibility for EU accession is for the majority of the electorate. And what's even greater proof of that is the fact that, as you've probably noticed, the former members of the Serbian Radical Party have become very big proponents of EU accession. And Nida wasn't one of the guys just down in Washington a couple weeks ago, and his mouth was just full of pro-American and pro-EU statements. It's really a very interesting turnaround in what's happened over the past 4 or 5 years, which it does show how powerful the power of EU attraction is for so many of the states in the region and populations. On doom and gloom, I'm sorry, where's doom and gloom? It comes down to, is the glass half empty or half full? There's a lot of things going on in Southeastern Europe that don't make the headlines, that we don't see, that we don't talk about on a daily basis, that I think are reason for concern. Just the economic situation, the fact that you've got, in different countries in the region, you've got anywhere from 15 to 35% unemployment rates and so forth, mainly among young people. That's a political and social time bomb that's there. And if something doesn't happen, something, could change pretty drastically, pretty quickly. I want to be very clear about what I'm saying. I'm not concerned about large-scale warfare in Southeastern Europe like we saw in the 1990s. What I am concerned about is what 15 or 20 people with AK-47s who want to cause some provocations can do. Whether we're talking about, Kosovo or southern Serbia or the Sanjak or Bosnia or Macedonia, wherever. We saw in this city what 20 people did a few years ago, and if that could happen in the most powerful country in the world, just imagine how, 20 extremists could destabilize small, weak countries in southeastern Europe. On top of that, I just want to add there's two unknown strategic variables, I think, in southeastern Europe that we still don't understand. It's too early to tell what impact they're going to have on politics in the region is going to be. One, I would say, is the return of Russia as a major factor in politics in southeastern Europe. And the second is the impact of the global financial crisis. It's still going to take us a couple of years to really get a good sense of what influence that has on how politics are going to play out. On the question of the significance of Cyprus, since I know very little about Cyprus, I'm going to pass on that. Aristotle is probably our resident expert on that issue, so he can talk about that if he wants to. Helen, you mentioned conditionality. Helen, where are you? With respect to Kosovo. Does Serbia need to recognize Kosovo to get into the EU? It's difficult at this point to make that argument since 5 members of the EU don't recognize Kosovo. So you can't force Serbia to do something if several members of the EU don't recognize it. And finally, Corey, you mentioned, does accession change behavior? I thought Venelin's talk was fascinating because it kind of said it does for a little bit, but behavior can change back afterwards. And I think that's sort of a big problem a lot of American political scientists have, is that if we write certain constitutions for Bosnia, for Macedonia, it's going to change the way these societies function and think. And I think the track record of the past 15 to 20 years is quite the opposite. It's eventually the constitutions and the rules have to change to reflect the values of the societies.
Just 2 brief points. First, what our colleague mentioned about how we should anticipate negative developments in new member states, no matter what. What might be called, actually I came up with a label, post-accession adventurism. That's very profound, and we should think about that. Right now, there is something called cooperation and verification mechanism, which was supposed to be the tool that the EU uses to continue to discipline elites in Bulgaria and Romania, but clearly that's not working. That's not enough. I haven't really studied this mechanism very well, so I cannot talk about its bureaucratic and administrative specifics, but I can clearly see the big picture, and the big picture is that this mechanism doesn't work. So there's got to be something else. What else might there be? This is what probably we need to talk about. And the doom and gloom, yeah, I want to make clear that still I'm talking about developments in polities that are recognizably democratic. And I was comparing Bulgaria and Romania pre and post January 1st, 2007. Had my analytical objective been to compare Romania and Bulgaria to Azerbaijan, I would have clearly pointed out that they are success stories, and Azerbaijan is a story of a democratic failure.
I got one question as regards state building mechanisms. I'm not deploring that the EU hasn't got any mechanisms for state or nation building. It's just a fact, and it produces again a certain dilemma, because the European Union, of course, cannot integrate dysfunctional states. EU can only function on the basis that you actually got a state which got a constitution and a political functioning system. So it finds itself in the dilemma that it is doing actually step 2 before it has achieved step 1, namely it's doing integration and harmonization of legislation and discussing the acquis before even you have the prerequisites for implementing such acquis. So in facing that dilemma, it escapes in inventing conditions and new conditions and another condition. And this is the fact that makes it so difficult also for countries in the region, because these conditions somehow have become this kind of moving target, and you never know what condition will come up next day. So in that, I believe this conditionality is counterproductive to a certain extent. It has been helpful for a number of issues, but there are some issues where we believe it is counterproductive.
Are there other questions? Yeah, go ahead, Tim.
I just want to jump in quickly to argue. The EU may not have an official policy towards recognition, but recognition is a state-level function. Each individual state can hold up membership simply by saying we won't allow them in until they do the following 16 things. In addition, the EU adds all sorts of non-acquis requirements like the ICTY cooperation. As to your point about the EU not integrating dysfunctional states, it let in Cyprus, which is not a functioning state. It let in Cyprus and said the acquis applies to the Greek side but is suspended in the northern side. So there is precedent for doing that. So.
Gordon, it's not that I necessarily disagree with what you're saying, but I do think that you are tending to kind of cherry pick some of the facts and not look at some of the sort of more optimistic developments in the region. And I think that if you take some of the more optimistic developments, the intense amount of regional cooperation which is taking place, and the reconsolidation of the region as an economic unit as a whole, and plenty of these, and culturally and socially, then the picture is much less gloomy. And I do think that, I wonder whether you'd kind of like let everyone to the point and then refuse to say, or balked at saying, fine, we'll just partition everything. I mean, that was the logic of where you were going, but you didn't say that. I mean, is that what you believe? That's the question. Big picture. I'm quite interested in what you're saying, because I wonder whether you talked about a big picture, but I wonder if we could like sort of Google Earthwise kind of like zoom up a little bit more, and let's say, let's like talk about Italy, for example, or let's talk about corruption in the British Parliament. I mean, does that mean that Bulgaria and Romania are particularly bad, or are they just sort of a little bit worse than other places within the EU? So I wonder if we just sort of like had a bigger picture, how would that fit in? And there were some other things, but I think that's enough to be getting on with. Okay.
Since I've been invited, I just want to make 3 very brief comments about Cyprus and whether it actually constitutes a precedent. I'm not sure, although it definitely constitutes creates a lot of complications in the process. The reason, 3 things I'd like to say. One is that when Cyprus became a candidate member, there was an implicit understanding. 9 more states were part of the deal, and Greece had to ratify in her parliament all other 9 states. And so Cyprus was part of the deal. Nothing comparable exists with the Western Balkan states. Secondly, the deal to give the go-ahead for Cyprus back in Helsinki in 1999 was also the deal that unlocked Turkey's European path. So on the one hand, you had Cyprus becoming officially a candidate member, but also you started Turkey's, there was no more Greek veto, and Turkey began her European path. Again, there's not a precedent. Now, I'm not saying whether this is good or bad, but I'm saying these are realities that I don't see in the Western Balkans. 2 very brief points. The people who made the deal back in '99 were not in power when you had the referendum on Cyprus in both Greece and Cyprus. So that's something. Unless something is down on paper, beware. There's a lesson there. Intriguingly, the people who supported a resolution of the Cyprus issue a few years back are now back in power in Greece. So I actually predict a lot of, but it's not about Cyprus here. Let me also say that the European Union only does recognize states. If you're not a recognized state, only if 1 or 2 states recognize you globally, things are not good in terms of your integration process. And that's something Kosovo, Gordon mentioned about 5 European states, but also you can see how Cyprus, where I'm going there. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's start again. Gordon.
Okay. Tim, I kind of like the way you put the question. But regarding partition, no, for the record, I'm against partition. But I do think that the only thing keeping 2 or 3 of these states together is the promise of EU accession. I'm sorry? Well, that's an interesting thing too, but that leads to the next point. Even given, or the UK for that matter, even given that point, I'm not convinced that EU accession is enough to keep some of these states together. If you look at what's going on the ground, I take your point that compared to 10, 15 years ago, things are immeasurably better. I mean, we all know large-scale military forces confronting each other and everything else that was going on. We don't have that problem today, obviously. Nevertheless, I think what's interesting when you look at what's going on the ground, the demographic data that I see shows that people are separating everywhere you look around the Balkans. Last year, for instance, more Serbs left Croatia than moved back. We all know how separated Bosnia and Herzegovina is, and I don't see any signs of integration there. Kosovo seems to be separating out, and Kosovo, of course, is divided north of the EU. But I've seen demographic data that suggests, I don't know, Ivica, maybe you've seen something more recent, that suggests that a lot of Macedonian Slavs are moving out of Western Macedonia. I've even seen data that says that Serbs are moving out of the Sanjak. So that seems to be the reality of what's happening on the ground. And what I wonder is whether, number one, it seems to be a process that we can't control. But number two, I'm just wondering what the political effects of this are going to be 10, 15, 20 years down the line. Whether at some point political reality has to catch up with demographic reality.
Okay.
So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. Fine, thanks, Vanelline.
Are Bulgaria and Romania different from the rest of the continent, from the rest of the EU members? Well, quantitatively speaking, yes, they are, because if you look at the CPI, the Corruption Perception Index, it's much worse in these two countries than elsewhere. Qualitatively speaking, probably not, because they're still members of the EU, and that's that. Now, with regards to this very, very big picture that you push us to look at, I don't know, I suppose from that, first of all, I have to study England and Italy in order to make these kinds of comparisons, which I don't want to do because I'm working on a very nice project on hard rock music now, which involves listening to Led Zeppelin, so why study British Parliament? But even if I were to do that, I'm a little bit skeptical about these kinds of big pictures where everything from kind of the analytical vantage points from which everything appears to be kind of roughly the same. All right, you can say that, but what's the analytical added value? What is interesting about this statement? So I think at this point, we might be very well advised to, look at small differences, these processes which probably don't matter so much if you are interested about the big picture, and study those. At least, I suppose I don't really have a good answer. It's really about intellectual taste, whether you'll be able to say something that applies to the entire continent, or whether you'd like to point to very subtle differences between Romania and Bulgaria. And in such disputes, I think there is no consensual position that can be reached. I suppose that's why we want to have a diverse intellectual academic community, so that each one of us studies different things.
Actually, I don't have anything concrete to say, but maybe an additional question to you. How do we actually know that these negative effects that you have been mentioning are caused by membership of the EU? How would the situation look like, these countries look like, if they were not yet members of the EU? Wouldn't it maybe much worse? It's now.
Well, you got me there. I thought this is a policy conference, not an academic conference where you get questions about variation on the dependent variable and closure and all these kinds of things. And that's a great point. I just don't have the counterfactual here. It might very well be true that these dynamics, these empirical developments that I claim are observable in both countries, that they may be due to some other factors. That is certainly a hypothesis that needs to be explored. I just don't see And again, I spoke only about political development, so it cannot be the economic crisis that causes all these things. So I just cannot see what else might there be, but certainly the quest for alternative explanations of these empirical trends should continue.
Well, I wanted to end with using what Kory Udovitsky talked about as the two channels. I think it sums up a lot of what we've been hearing, which is quite fascinating. Is that, Venelin, in your last answer to Marie-Janine, you actually did give a causal mechanism for the first of your three, in the corruption and cronyism, that it had to do specifically with the attraction competition for FDI during that period, and once they got it, then they could go back to their more normal patterns of cronyism. That's very interesting. The other two are political mechanisms. And I think it's worth, in a sense, taking Tim Judah's two comments to Gordon as a framing for this, is that it's not clear that all the good things happening regionally, about which you're now writing, are related to the EU process. And because Marie-Janine was very clear, for example, on the trade, that Bosnia is a net loser of that. So those elements of what's happening regionally that influence the topic of this panel don't look so positive. So it's getting back to her question, what's causally related to the EU process that I think we want to think about, whereas we might be really pleased, nonetheless, at the positive things that are happening regionally. But if we think about Kory's two channels, which is on the one hand the democratic process, and secondly this highly technocratic negotiating, what we know in all of the cases for the new members, that the accession process is elite-driven, technocratic, bureaucratic, fast-track, prevent as much democratic involvement, including the parliament, as possible. I have a student who did the Hungarian case in great detail. That's why I say that with such authority. And also, if we think about Italy, or Britain or Belgium, that is to say original members, the Italians to this day will tell you that the smartest choice their government ever made was the decision to be a founding member of the EU, because they were absolutely not ready. If they had made a rational decision in terms of conditions, they weren't ready when they did. But being on the inside and not having to go through this process as a new member is quite a very, very different thing in terms of whether we assess state building in Belgium and Spain on the one hand, or now in Britain and corruption on the other. And so to me, what's really interesting is how, in what I've learned today from this panel, is how both in the new members, one goes from the technocratic, elite-driven process to the democratic process. Or, as I asked Venelin early on after your first remarks, how elite reputation in terms of being perceived as European shifts to reputation in terms of their voting constituencies and what they do or do not do for them. Or you could go the reverse, is the way in which voting constituents in some of the other new member states, I think again of the new research on Hungary, find that when they cannot get accountability in the parliament to their issues, they then use European institutions to put pressure, so that there is now an interactive effect. So I would close only by asking a question that I hope I might myself get some answers from the second panel, which is, what is the effect of this technocratic, elite-driven process of the accession on the potential candidate members, given that, as Kory Udovitsky also mentioned, they're having to go through a much longer process, and so one can imagine, in relation to the questions about Serbian politics, for example, that the democratic elements, the interaction between elites and the people within the country, political elites in their country, is likely to be more involved prior to membership than after. I'm not quite sure, but these are obviously long-term processes that, in the end, I think we want to do the social science analysis before we make policy recommendations. Thank you all for joining us. We will now break for lunch, and we will return to this room at 1:30.